Long before dates were carved into stone or names were pressed into clay, the world moved without labels. There were no borders drawn with certainty, no maps folded into authority, no calendars insisting where history should begin. Life unfolded without captions. Memory lived in breath and gesture, in the repetition of firelight stories and the quiet knowing passed from one body to the next. Nothing announced itself as important, nothing asked to be recorded. In this unnamed world, knowledge did not belong to pages. It travelled through rhythm, through movement, through watching the sky, until patterns became familiar. What mattered was not written down, because writing had not yet learned how to pretend it could hold everything. Instead, memory was carried carefully, shaped to survive without needing ink or permanence. It was fluid, adaptable, and remarkably durable. Modern history, as it is often told, begins suddenly. A few river valleys appear, and with them arrive farming, cities, rulers, and language, fully formed and confident. Humanity seems to wake up all at once, as if nothing meaningful came before the first bricks were stacked or the first crown was lifted. What came earlier is pushed into a single word, thin and dismissive, suggesting a long stretch of waiting rather than living. Yet, silence is not the same as emptiness. The absence of records does not imply the absence of experience. It only tells us that whatever came before did not rely on the same tools we now trust. When we label a vast expanse of time as prehistory, we quietly decide that it has little to teach us, that it is merely the rough draft before the real story begins. But drafts are only incomplete when compared to final versions that assume they are finished. What if the story did not begin where we think it did? What if what feels like a beginning is actually a return, a careful rebuilding after something more subtle stepped away? The idea is uncomfortable, not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet. It suggests that the past did not explode or vanish in flames. It receded, it loosened its grip and allowed memory to thin. In such a world, complexity would not announce itself through monuments or inscriptions. It would move inward, settling into ritual, habit, and instinct. Knowledge would hide inside stories that change shape without losing their core. Wisdom would not demand to be seen. It would wait to be noticed. This possibility does not require believing in lost cities or forgotten kings. It asks only that we question the habit of equating silence with simplicity. A world without names is not necessarily a world without structure. It may be one that understood the cost of permanence and chose softness instead. As the centuries passed and memory shifted from bodies into symbols, something was gained, but something else was surrendered. Writing made knowledge visible, but it also made forgetting easier. What could not be written cleanly began to fade from importance. What resisted definition slipped into shadow. And so history, as we inherit it, begins with certainty and confidence, while something older lingers just beyond reach. Not erased, not destroyed, simply left behind, like a whisper that did not need to be louder to remain true. In the silence before the first records, there may be traces already waiting, small inconsistencies that do not belong to a world that was empty, but to one that had already lived and learned when to let go. Perhaps the earliest chapter of humanity was not meant to be read straight through. It was meant to be felt, sensed between moments, half remembered in dreams and instincts. When we listen carefully, the quiet does not resist us. It invites us closer, preparing the ground for the first fractures that will soon appear, places where silence thins just enough to show that it was incomplete. History, when seen from a distance, appears confident and complete, a straight line drawn with steady hands. Dates follow dates, discoveries follow discoveries, and progress seems to move in a single direction, forward. Yet when the line is examined closely, it begins to fray. There are stretches where nothing quite fits, where momentum slows or disappears, and where the record grows thin without explanation. These are not brief pauses. They are long silences, sitting quietly between chapters, waiting to be noticed. These interruptions are uncomfortable because they resist simple answers. Across different regions, civilizations seem to emerge already equipped with agriculture, structured belief, observation of the sky, and systems of authority. The usual explanation suggests independent invention, repeated again and again by chance. But coincidence grows harder to accept when the pattern repeats with such confidence. Something appears to be missing between ignorance and sophistication, as if steps were skipped or erased. The narration does not accuse the past of hiding secrets, nor does it challenge scholars directly. Instead, it pauses inside the phrase we hear so often: "We do not know yet." That statement is not a failure, but it is also not an ending. It creates space where questions are allowed to rest without being solved, and where curiosity can exist without urgency. In that space, the gaps begin to feel less like mistakes and more like clues. Consider how often history compresses uncertainty into a paragraph and then moves on. Entire centuries are brushed aside with a sentence, as though time itself had nothing to say. The effect is subtle but powerful. The mind is trained to expect continuity, to believe that advancement naturally follows collapse. When that expectation is challenged, discomfort arises, not because the idea is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. There is another possibility, spoken softly rather than declared. What if these gaps are not empty, but layered? What if progress did not restart from nothing, but reorganized itself after interruption? Civilizations may not rise from bare ground, but from foundations already weathered, already shaped by hands no longer remembered. In this view, history does not flow like a river. It settles like sediment. The idea is unsettling because it suggests continuity where we expect beginnings. It implies that knowledge can survive without visibility, that understanding can be carried forward quietly until conditions allow it to surface again. The familiar story of invention becomes something else entirely. Discovery turns into recognition. Creation becomes inheritance. The past stops feeling distant and starts feeling close, almost uncomfortably so. Rather than rushing toward answers, this moment invites patience. The timeline does not need to be repaired, it needs to be observed. Once the gaps are allowed to exist, they begin to point beyond themselves. They suggest prior chapters, earlier movements, and traces softened by time. From here, the story naturally leans forward, not to prove what came before, but to notice the faint marks that should not be there if history were as simple as it appears. These marks are rarely dramatic. They show up as awkward transitions, as sudden leaps in ability, as moments where explanation feels thinner than reality. They remain easy to overlook because they do not interrupt the story loudly. Instead, they whisper from the margins. The more gently one looks, the more persistent they become, hinting that the past may be deeper than the surface narrative allows. As this sense of layering settles in, curiosity shifts direction. Attention moves away from accepted beginnings and toward what might have come before them, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. If the timeline contains fractures, then something pressed against it from the other side, something faint, incomplete, and easily missed. Following those traces does not require belief, only attentiveness. The next step is simple and inevitable. To look for what remains, however subtle, and to listen for echoes that could not exist if the silence were truly whole. With that awareness, the story loosens its grip on certainty and prepares to move further inward, toward the first visible inconsistencies, the quiet remnants that history cannot quite explain, but also cannot fully erase, and waits patiently for understanding to arrive in time alone. Long after cities rose and fell, certain stories refused to rest. They traveled without passports, crossed oceans without ships, and appeared in places that never spoke to one another. These stories did not announce themselves as history. They arrived as myth, ritual, symbol, and song, carrying familiar shapes in unfamiliar languages. Again and again, different cultures spoke of great waters that erased an earlier age, of watchers who studied the sky as though it mattered deeply, of teachers who arrived with knowledge and then quietly vanished. The repetition is not loud, but it is persistent. What makes these echoes unsettling is not that they exist, but that they feel older than the cultures that preserved them. They do not sound like inventions, they sound like recollections softened by time. There is no clear origin point, no single place where these ideas begin. They appear already worn, already shaped, as though passed down through many hands before ever being written or carved. Each culture tells the story slightly differently, yet something essential remains intact. Rather than treating these similarities as evidence, it is more useful to experience them as sensation, a feeling of familiarity without recognition. Like hearing a melody you cannot place, yet knowing you have heard it before. These echoes ask nothing of the listener. They simply repeat, patiently, across generations that no longer remember why they were first told. One explanation suggests coincidence, that human minds simply arrive at similar ideas when faced with similar challenges. Another suggests borrowing, ideas traveling slowly through contact and trade. Both explanations offer comfort, because they keep history contained. Yet, neither fully explains why these stories feel deeper than necessity, why they speak of loss rather than origin, remembrance rather than discovery. There is another possibility, one that does not insist on certainty. What if these stories are not inventions at all, but remnants? Fragments of understanding carried forward long after their source disappeared. In this view, early civilizations were not standing at the beginning of knowledge, but in the aftermath of something larger. They inherited impressions, not instructions, memories without context. The idea arrives gently, without demanding belief. Humanity may remember more than it realizes, but not consciously. The past may still live inside, symbol and ritual, encoded in ways that bypass logic and speak directly to intuition. These echoes do not prove anything. They simply suggest continuity where none is expected. If something vast once shaped human awareness, its absence would not erase its influence. It would only quiet it. Knowledge that once belonged to many could become story. Story could become myth. Myth could become tradition. At each stage, clarity would fade, but presence would remain. This is the first moment in the story where the silence begins to feel intentional. Not everything vanishes through disaster. Some things withdraw. They allow memory to survive without inviting replication. The echoes feel careful, restrained, as though meant to guide without revealing too much. By now, the listener may sense that these repeating fragments are not random decorations on the surface of history. They are pressure points, places where something older pushes gently against the present. They do not explain themselves. They ask to be noticed. And once noticed, they demand a question that cannot be avoided. Echoes do not exist without a source. Whispers do not travel without a voice that once spoke. If these stories are memories rather than myths, then they point backward towards something that cast them, something that no longer stands in view. Following that suggestion does not require certainty, only curiosity, and a willingness to look beyond individual cultures toward whatever once stood behind them all, leaving traces that refuse to disappear. That search begins not with answers, but with attention, as the narrative slowly turns from echoes themselves toward the distant, hidden origin that may have released them. When people search for a lost civilization, they imagine broken stone, fallen walls, and buried cities. They expect scale, dominance, and permanence, because those are the markers modern history recognizes. Anything quieter is dismissed, overlooked, or assumed incomplete. Yet this expectation may be the reason nothing obvious has ever appeared. The question then shifts. Not where is the civilization, but why we assume it must look familiar. If advancement once followed a different logic, our tools of detection would slide past it without recognition. Absence would feel natural, not suspicious, and silence would appear empty rather than intentional design choice. Civilizations obsessed with continuity build upward, outward, and loudly. They declare themselves through scale, carving dominance into landscape and memory. But a society that valued balance over control would leave a different imprint. Its achievements might dissolve back into surroundings, mistaken for nature itself, never demanding recognition as proof power. Such a civilization would not announce itself through empire or conquest. It might move lightly, adapting rather than replacing, blending instead of conquering. Over time, its presence would fade deliberately, leaving behind habits, patterns, and sensitivities rather than ruins. What remains would feel accidental, natural, or coincidental, never demanding excavation. This possibility unsettles modern confidence. We are trained to equate success with growth, permanence, and visibility. Something that leaves almost nothing feels like failure. Yet failure assumes an intention to stay. If disappearance was deliberate, then invisibility becomes strength, not weakness. Stepping aside could represent awareness, restraint, or even completion. The twist arrives quietly. The forgotten civilization may not be missing because it was destroyed, but because it refused to dominate what followed. Choosing withdrawal over expansion, It allowed others to rise without competition, without shadow. Its absence created space, not emptiness, letting history believe it was starting fresh last. This reframing asks for patience. It does not reject archaeology, science, or record. It simply suggests that our search habits favor noise over nuance. We scan for collapsed capitals, not vanished philosophies. We hunt monuments, not intentions. What does not break fails to hold attention, even if it shaped everything. If such a civilization existed, its traces would be indirect. They would appear as patterns, alignments, recurring ideas, and shared intuitions. Nothing pointing loudly to ownership. Only suggestions of influence. To find it, one would need to change how looking works, learning to notice what blends instead of stands out. Seen this way, the search itself becomes the obstacle. We expect ruins, while something intentionally quiet leaves almost nothing to excavate. The record remains intact, yet misread. Meaning hides not underground, but in plain sight, waiting for a different kind of attention to reveal itself slowly, without announcement or resistance. Once this idea settles, curiosity changes direction. The question is no longer what was lost, but how something so careful could leave influence without identity. That realization prepares the mind to move forward, away from monuments, towards subtler signs. What follows will not look like ruins, but reflections scattered ahead. These reflections rarely announce themselves. They exist as alignments, shared symbols, and recurring orientations toward the world. They suggest intention without signature, design without credit. Following them requires restraint, a willingness to observe rather than claim, to listen without naming what is heard. This shift in attention opens next stage. What begins next is not discovery, but recognition. The search grows softer, more patient, attuned to pattern instead of proof. By letting go of expectations, the story prepares to notice what survived indirectly. From here, history loosens further, and the path ahead leads toward faint traces that should not exist. These traces will not resolve uncertainty, they will deepen it. But within that uncertainty, something begins to take shape. The narrative turns gently outward, following suggestion rather than certainty. What remains ahead is not a ruin, but an echo, leading toward the civilization that once cast it and stepped away. Across the ancient world, traces of understanding appear that feel strangely out of place. Structures align with stars long before telescopes existed. Measurements reflect harmony rather than convenience. Stone is shaped not just to stand, but to point, to listen, to interact with sky and season. This knowledge arrives without hesitation, without a visible learning curve. It does not stumble into existence. It stands complete. The feeling this creates is not excitement, but quiet confusion. Civilizations credited with these works often show no gradual development leading toward them. There are no rough drafts, no experimental failures preserved in the record. Instead, the first expressions are already refined, already precise, as though someone remembered how rather than discovered why. The absence of visible trial makes the presence of mastery difficult to explain. Rather than celebrate brilliance, the narration lingers on restraint. It suggests that later cultures may not have invented these frameworks at all. They may have inherited patterns whose origins were already distant by the time they arrived. What was received was not instruction, but structure, not theory, but arrangement. Reverence replaced understanding, and repetition became preservation. When knowledge cannot be explained, it is protected through ritual. Movements are repeated until meaning hides within motion. Alignments are honored long after their purpose fades from language. Ceremonies become containers, holding information safely when explanation would only fracture it. In this way, understanding survives not because it is understood, but because it is respected. This survival does not require books or formulas. It depends on rhythm, orientation, and timing. Knowledge aligns with sunrise, solstice, and shadow. It embeds itself in habit and landscape, allowing collapse to pass without fully erasing what matters. Writing can burn, stone can crumble, but repeated action, tied to the world itself, is harder to lose. The confusion deepens when these patterns appear across distant cultures with no clear line of transmission. Similar orientations, proportions, and symbolic relationships emerge again and again, as if knowledge resurfaced independently in places already prepared to receive it. This repetition feels less like invention and more like memory, reactivating under the right conditions. What emerges is not proof, but pressure. Pressure on the assumption that complexity must evolve step by step. Pressure on the belief that humanity always begins in ignorance. Instead, a softer possibility unfolds. Awareness may survive interruption, carrying itself forward quietly until stability allows it to surface again. The calmness of this realization is important. There is no urgency to solve the mystery. Knowledge does not demand recognition. It exists whether named or not. Its survival through ritual suggests intention, a design that favored endurance over explanation. Those who carried it may have known that understanding ripens slowly, only when readiness returns. If this knowledge predated the civilizations that used it, then its creators recede further into silence. Their absence becomes more pronounced, not because their work is gone, but because it remains without attribution. Something was known, then handed down, then remembered imperfectly. The trail leads backward through repetition rather than record. At this point, the question no longer concerns architecture or alignment. It turns toward the human element. Knowledge does not persist alone. It travels with people, with communities who choose to protect it rather than display it. If understanding survived while its source vanished, then something happened to those who carried it. That unanswered question waits ahead, gently pulling the narrative forward toward the fate of the keepers themselves. That fate does not announce itself through catastrophe alone. It may unfold as choice, dispersal, or transformation, so subtle it leaves no clear ending. Those who held the knowledge could have dissolved into emerging cultures, carrying fragments without titles or authority. Their role would end quietly once memory became stable enough to survive without guardians. In that moment, disappearance becomes completion, not loss. Understanding no longer needs protection when it has merged with the rhythms of daily life. This possibility does not answer questions, it softens them. It suggests that the carriers did not vanish from the world, but from history's spotlight, leaving behind a civilization measured not by what it built, but by what it allowed to endure. Long after memory outlived names and silence remained. Disappearance is usually explained as failure. Cities fall, people scatter, knowledge breaks, and history closes a chapter. Yet this explanation assumes that all endings are accidents. It leaves little room for intention, or for a civilization capable of choosing when its role was complete. This section invites a different image. Instead of collapse, imagine withdrawal. Instead of destruction, imagine dispersal so gradual it barely registers. A civilization does not need to be erased to disappear. It can dissolve into what comes after. Such a choice would leave almost no trace in the way history expects. No ruined capitals, no final battles, no sudden silence recorded by scribes. The departure would be quiet, spread across generations, hidden inside movement rather than memory. People might migrate without calling it escape. Traditions might be shared until ownership fades. Language shifts, soften meaning. Knowledge becomes communal, then ordinary, then invisible. What once required guardians no longer needs protection. The most powerful act in this scenario is restraint. By stepping out of the center, the civilization removes itself from competition with what follows. It does not demand remembrance or loyalty. It allows successors to believe they are first, and in doing so, gives them freedom. History shaped by restraint looks incomplete when compared to empires built on expansion. Yet incompleteness is not weakness. It can be deliberate design. A civilization that understands cycles may recognize the moment when remaining visible becomes harmful. Staying too long risks domination, imitation, or misuse of knowledge no longer meant for repetition. Disappearance, then, becomes preservation. By dissolving into emerging cultures, the civilization ensures its influence spreads without control. This way of leaving does not produce ruins to investigate. It leaves sensibilities, orientations, and quiet assumptions about how the world should be approached. These impressions survive because they are unclaimed. There is no triumph in this ending, only calm. The civilization does not announce its wisdom. It does not warn. It steps aside and trusts that fragments will be enough. What matters is no longer ownership, but continuity. For those who come later, the absence feels natural. Nothing obvious is missing. The past feels simple, even primitive, because what was complex chose not to remain visible. Disappearance creates the illusion of beginning. This illusion becomes fertile ground for new civilizations. Believing themselves first, they build confidently, unaware they are standing within a larger rhythm. The forgotten civilization does not interrupt this process. It supports it by staying silent. The emotional weight of this idea does not come from loss, but from perspective. Something immense once existed, and its greatest achievement may have been knowing when to withdraw. Power, in this sense, is the ability to let go. This understanding does not demand agreement. It settles quietly, leaving the listener with a feeling rather than an answer. The forgotten civilization becomes less a problem to solve and more a presence that can be sensed. If disappearance was intentional, then what remains takes on new meaning. Patterns, symbols, and shared assumptions are no longer accidents. They are traces shaped by choice rather than collapse. This realization opens the path forward. Instead of searching for ruins, the narrative turns toward influence. Instead of asking what was lost, it begins to notice what quietly endured, shaping every civilization that followed without ever asking to be remembered. These traces do not lead to certainty. They lead to awareness. And awareness changes the way history is read, not as a sequence of victories and failures, but as a series of choices made in silence. With that awareness, the story does not end. It deepens. The next movement follows what survived this disappearance, the quiet marks left behind, and how they continued to guide humanity long after their creators stepped away. Those marks are subtle, but they persist, waiting patiently in pattern and memory, ready to shape what comes next without ever revealing where they began from. Across the ruins of ancient worlds, certain shapes appear with unsettling familiarity. Circles carved into stone, spirals traced into earth, angles held with careful restraint. These forms do not feel decorative. They feel deliberate, repeated with confidence across cultures that never spoke, traded, or shared memory. Geometry arrives quietly, like a shared language remembered, rather than learned. It is tempting to call this coincidence, but coincidence loses comfort when repetition becomes exact. The same proportions emerge again and again, balanced in ways that calm the eye and steady the mind. These shapes do not explain themselves. They do not teach. They simply exist, inviting recognition without instruction, comprehension without vocabulary. There is no visible childhood to this knowledge, no gradual experimentation etched into history. The first appearances already display confidence, harmony, and precision. It feels less like invention and more like recall, as though humanity stumbled upon something familiar and knew, instinctively, how it fit. The calm these forms create is important. They soothe rather than impress. They settle rather than dominate. Geometry, here, behaves like memory stored in shape. Unlike words, it does not fracture when languages dissolve. It waits patiently, intact, ready to be recognized by any culture that learns how to see. Consider how easily writing is lost. Pages burn, symbols fade, meaning erodes. Geometry resists this fragility. A circle remains a circle, whether named or not. A ratio holds even when forgotten. Knowledge embedded this way survives collapse, not by being preserved, but by being inevitable. What unsettles historians is not the presence of these shapes, but their completeness. They do not appear as rough attempts improved over centuries. They arrive whole. This suggests transmission rather than discovery, inheritance rather than creation. Geometry feels carried forward, rediscovered when conditions allow, then set down again. This understanding does not demand belief. It asks only for attention. When similar forms appear across continents and ages, something deeper than preference is at work. Shape becomes signal. Proportion becomes memory. Knowledge no longer belongs to one place, but moves with people, quietly, without attribution. The absence of explanation is part of the design. Geometry does not tell stories. It aligns bodies with space, minds with pattern, attention with rhythm. Those who inherit it may forget why it works, yet continue to honor it, sensing its reliability long after its origin fades. Seen this way, geometry becomes less a tool and more a vessel. It carries meaning safely through time, immune to censorship, collapse, or misunderstanding. Anyone prepared to notice it can receive what it holds, even if they cannot name where it came from. This realization settles quietly, altering perception without announcement. The world begins to feel patterned rather than random. Paths matter. Placements matter. Geometry is no longer confined to structures, but appears embedded in how humans move, choose, and orient themselves. If these shapes traveled forward intact, they did not move alone. Geometry suggests pathways, alignments across land and horizon. It hints at knowledge walking alongside migration, settling briefly, then moving on again. To follow it, one must look beyond walls toward landscape itself. The story does not conclude here. Geometry opens a door rather than closes it. If knowledge was carried in shape, then the earth itself may hold the next clues, waiting in lines, crossings, and placements that reveal where memory traveled next. Those traces are subtle, almost dismissible, yet they persist with quiet confidence. They appear in the way sights face horizons, in distances that feel chosen, in repetitions too patient to be accidental. Following them requires slowing down, allowing perception to replace expectation, and preparing to read the land as the next archive. This shift marks the passage toward movement itself, where geometry leaves stone behind and begins revealing how memory mapped the world long before borders existed, and why those paths still quietly influence where civilization chooses to stand today without realizing it. Beyond individual shapes, another pattern begins to emerge, one that only becomes visible when distance is allowed to dissolve. Ancient sites, scattered across continents, appear to speak to one another through placement rather than proximity. Invisible lines seem to stretch across oceans and mountains, connecting places that should never have known each other, yet appear aligned by something deeper than chance. The narration invites the mind to slow down and picture the world as a single surface instead of divided territory. Certain locations feel chosen, not convenient. They rest where land, sky, and horizon meet in meaningful balance. These places do not behave like random settlements. They feel discovered rather than claimed, as though someone recognized their significance long before the first structures were raised. What unsettles is not that alignment exists, but that it repeats. Again and again, distant sites echo each other's orientation, spacing, and relationship to natural cycles. Oceans do not interrupt this pattern. Mountains do not confuse it. The world itself seems to have been read as a whole, not fragmented into regions waiting to be explored. The tone remains quiet, allowing the idea to settle without resistance. This is not presented as proof, but as suggestion. A recurring choice, made calmly, over long stretches of time. Early cultures often arrived at places already heavy with meaning, building where attention had already gathered, rather than creating importance from nothing. Such behavior implies awareness that reaches beyond local survival. It hints at a knowledge of the planet as a system, understood in its entirety rather than discovered piece by piece. Someone, or something, may have perceived the world as unified long before later civilizations understood it as divided. The reveal does not arrive as shock, but as humility. Alignment suggests foresight, not accident. It suggests perspective, wide enough to recognize relationships between far horizons. This understanding would not need to be explained. It would only need to be honored, followed, and repeated when possible. As the listener absorbs this scale, attention shifts away from builders and toward land itself. If placement carried meaning, then geography may not be passive backdrop. The earth becomes active participant, storing memory not in stone alone, but in position and relationship. What remains may not wait beneath soil, but in patterns waiting to be noticed. This realization changes how searching works. Excavation becomes secondary, observation becomes primary. Lines are not dug up, they are traced slowly, imagined gently, felt rather than measured. The planet begins to look less like a stage and more like a record. With that shift, the narrative prepares to move again. If locations were chosen intentionally, then the land itself remembers. It holds alignment long after names fade. The next step is not to uncover ruins, but to listen to the surface, where memory waits quietly, spread across the world, ready to be read by those willing to see the planet not as territory, but as archive. At a certain point, the search moves beyond structures entirely. Stone walls crumble, symbols erode, and language dissolves, but the land remains. Mountains hold their positions. Coastlines curve patiently. Deserts stretch unchanged for ages longer than memory can track. In this stillness, a different idea begins to surface. Perhaps the Earth itself was never just a setting for history, but its most enduring record. Long before monuments were raised, certain places were already treated with reverence, peaks that were never climbed casually. Valleys entered with ceremony, shores approached with care. These locations were not chosen at random, nor explained through conquest or convenience. They were recognized, as though meaning already lived there, waiting rather than demanding. This recognition suggests a quieter form of intelligence. Instead of carving memory into fragile structures, a civilization may have embedded significance into geography itself. Mountains do not burn. Deserts do not rot. Coastlines change, but slowly, predictably. By using the planet as an archive, knowledge could survive catastrophes that erase cities and scatter populations. In this view, the Earth becomes a living library, not one filled with instructions, but with orientation. Meaning is stored in relationship, placement, and rhythm. Certain places feel heavy not because of what was built on them, but because of what passed through them. Attention gathered there long before names were spoken. The emotional shift arrives gently. History no longer feels distant or buried. It feels present, layered beneath every step. The ground is no longer neutral. It has been used, read, and remembered. Forgetting was never total, it was postponed. Ancient cultures may not have fully understood the signals they were responding to. They built where resonance was already strong. They honored places that felt aligned without knowing why. Ritual followed intuition. Structure followed sensation. Over time, meaning remained even as explanation faded. Floods can wash away walls. Erosion can soften carvings. But a mountain keeps its horizon. A coastline keeps its curve. Knowledge placed here does not need guardians. It waits. When people return, they feel it again, even if they cannot explain the pull. This intimacy between humanity and land reframes memory itself. The past does not sit behind us. It surrounds us. It breathes quietly through terrain that has outlived every story told about it. Walking across the world becomes an act of reading, even when we forget we are doing so. The forgotten civilization, seen this way, did not hide its legacy underground. It spread it wide, dissolving identity into environment. Ownership disappeared. Influence remained. No single generation could claim it. Every generation could feel it. The Earth does not argue. It does not explain. It simply holds. Those who learn how to listen may sense guidance without instruction, presence without voice. Memory does not demand recovery. It reveals itself through alignment and attention. As this realization settles, the narrative shifts again. If the world itself carries memory, then early civilizations were not inventing meaning from nothing. They were responding. They were listening to signals they did not create, shaping cultures around places that already knew more than they could name. This prepares the path forward. What follows is not about lost builders or hidden empires, but about inheritance. Civilizations did not stand alone. They grew within landscapes already encoded with direction. The next movement explores how these societies became caretakers rather than creators, responding to a world that remembered long before they ever arrived. When history describes the rise of civilization, it often does so as a slow awakening. Humans experiment, fail, adapt, and gradually learn how to farm, govern, measure time, and give shape to belief. Progress, in this telling, is cautious and incremental. Yet when the earliest civilizations step into view, they do not behave like beginners. They arrive organized, symbolic, and strangely confident in what they are doing. Cities appear with planned layouts. Agriculture functions at scale. Social roles are already defined. The sky is watched with intention, not curiosity. There is little evidence of prolonged trial, of centuries spent guessing before understanding settles. Instead, structures and systems emerge almost fully formed, as though a foundation had already been laid somewhere out of sight. This immediacy creates tension beneath the surface of the story. It does not accuse history of being wrong, but it quietly asks how learning moved so quickly. Knowledge seems to arrive ahead of explanation. Practice precedes theory. Ritual exists before justification. The effect is not one of discovery, but of recognition. The calm tone allows this idea to unfold without confrontation. Perhaps what appears as sudden brilliance is not invention at all. It may be preservation. Early civilizations may have stepped into roles they did not design, repeating patterns already tested by time. What looks like genius could simply be careful maintenance of something older. Symbols reinforce this possibility. Myth, architecture, and ceremony often echo one another across distant cultures, suggesting shared frameworks rather than isolated imagination. These civilizations behave less like founders and more like stewards, responsible for keeping meaning intact rather than reshaping it endlessly. To inherit does not require understanding everything that is inherited. One can follow rhythms without knowing their origin. One can maintain alignments without grasping their full significance. Repetition becomes respect. Change becomes caution. Innovation slows, not because imagination is absent, but because memory advises restraint. Seen this way, the first civilizations may have understood themselves as continuing something rather than starting it. They did not claim to be alone or original. Many spoke of ages before them, of ancestors or teachers who arrived earlier, bringing order that needed to be protected rather than improved. This humility is easy to overlook when reading their remains through a modern lens. The idea is subtle but powerful. Civilization does not rise from ignorance into knowledge. It inherits orientation, then adapts carefully. Progress becomes an act of tending, not conquering. What matters is continuity, not novelty. This reframing removes the urgency to explain everything as rapid innovation. Instead, it invites patience. Knowledge can exist without visible development. It can be carried quietly across interruptions, resurfacing when stability returns. As this perspective settles, attention turns naturally towards story rather than structure. If early societies were caretakers, then their myths were not fantasies. They were containers. Within them, hints of origin were preserved, softened into narrative so they could survive without authority. These stories may not name their sources clearly, but they gesture toward them. Teachers who arrive already knowing, figures who step in, establish order, and depart. Ages that ended not with conquest, but with retreat. Myth becomes memory disguised as meaning. The listener is not asked to replace one certainty with another, only to notice how familiar assumptions grow quieter under careful observation. Civilization's first step forward may feel like a continuation, because it was. Something had already moved the path beneath human feet. This realization opens the next question gently. If knowledge was inherited, then someone carried it. Someone chose how much to give and how much to withhold. Their presence lingers in story and symbol, waiting to be recognized not as legend, but as trace. With this shift, the narrative leans forward again, away from cities and toward the figures who stand just beyond them. Those who appear briefly, guide quietly, and vanish without leaving names behind, yet whose influence shaped the earliest chapters of human order. Across ancient traditions, certain figures step forward again and again, arriving without clear origin and leaving without resistance. They appear at turning points, when societies are forming or reshaping themselves. They do not conquer territory or claim crowns. They teach, they organize. They align people with rhythms already present, then fade quietly from the story. These figures are remarkably consistent across distance and time. They arrive knowing what is needed, not experimenting or asking permission. Law, measurement, cultivation, and orientation appear through them, already shaped. Their authority is never enforced, it is accepted. Once their role is complete, they depart without drama, leaving behind systems that continue without them. The tone of these stories is important. There is no collapse when the teachers leave. No war, no betrayal, no final speech. Disappearance feels expected, almost required. The knowledge remains, but the presence withdraws. This pattern repeats with a calm that resists interpretation as accident. Rather than treating these figures as historical individuals, it may be more useful to see them as symbols, not people, but functions. Memory given form so it can move through story. Knowledge personified so it can survive without explanation. In this view, the teacher is not a character, but a role that appears when needed and dissolves once stability returns. This reframing changes the emotional weight. The teachers are not lost, they are complete. Their disappearance is not failure, but design. Staying too long would shift their role from guide to ruler. Leaving preserves balance. These stories rarely celebrate the teachers themselves. Instead, they emphasize what was given: techniques, calendars, ethics, orientation towards sky and land. The absence of personal detail feels intentional, as though identity would only distract from function. What matters is not who they were, but what they activated. Over time, these figures blur. Names change, details conflict, yet the pattern remains intact. Sudden arrival, transmission of knowledge, quiet departure. The repetition becomes the message. Something important was shared carefully, then allowed to blend into culture without claiming ownership. This introduces a quiet twist. What if these teachers were never meant to be remembered as individuals? What if they represent a system designed to pass knowledge forward without remaining visible? Memory moving through narrative, adapting itself so it could survive misunderstanding. If knowledge was carried this way, then it was never meant to remain unchanged. It was shaped to endure, not to stay pure. Each culture adjusted it slightly, preserving structure while losing context. This explains both continuity and distortion. The message survives, but its origin softens. The calmness of this process is striking. There is no urgency to preserve accuracy. Survival matters more than precision. Understanding can return later, when conditions allow. For now, repetition is enough. These teachers do not argue or insist. They do not return to correct mistakes. Their role ends once knowledge takes root. This restraint suggests awareness of limits, an understanding that interference beyond a certain point would harm rather than help. By the time later civilizations tell these stories, the teachers already feel ancient. They belong to a time before certainty. Their presence is accepted without question, their absence noted without grief. Memory becomes atmosphere rather than record. As the listener absorbs this pattern, a deeper question begins to form. If knowledge was given selectively, through figures designed to vanish, then change was expected. Nothing was meant to remain frozen. Knowledge was allowed to evolve, distort, and fragment, trusting that something essential would persist. This prepares the transition ahead. The story no longer asks who the teachers were, but why knowledge itself was treated this way, why it was not preserved intact, why forgetting appears built into the process. The teachers fade again, doing what they always do. Their work complete, their presence no longer required. What remains is influence without authorship, wisdom without ownership. The narrative leans forward, ready to explore why memory was shaped to change and what danger existed in remembering too clearly, too completely, for too long. At some point, a quiet boundary appears in the story. Knowledge is present, but never whole. Civilizations receive enough to orient themselves, enough to build, enough to survive, yet never enough to recreate what came before. This incompleteness is not accidental. It feels measured, almost intentional, as though something was carefully withheld. The narration settles into this idea gently. Power, when shared without limit, tends to repeat itself. It accelerates growth beyond balance. It encourages dominance, expansion, and the illusion of permanence. A civilization given everything it remembers risks becoming what it already was, restarting the cycle without pause or reflection. Instead, memory arrives filtered. Systems are passed down without full explanation. Frameworks remain, but context fades. Knowledge becomes practical rather than total, useful rather than absolute. This restraint slows growth just enough for adaptation to matter. Civilizations rise, but not too quickly. They stabilize before they overwhelm themselves. Forgetting, in this light, is no longer weakness. It becomes protection. It prevents repetition from becoming stagnation. It allows variation instead of imitation. Each cycle begins with familiarity, but not certainty, giving humanity space to respond rather than repeat. There is a softness to this realization. Nothing is stolen, nothing is broken. The past does not punish the future by withholding truth. It simply trusts that remembering everything at once would do more harm than good. Awareness, delivered too early, collapses under its own weight. Inherited knowledge functions like scaffolding rather than blueprint. It supports growth without dictating outcome. Early civilizations were given orientation, not instruction manuals. They were pointed toward balance, but left to discover their own limits. This explains the strange mixture of sophistication and confusion found in ancient cultures. They knew enough to act, but not enough to dominate. They followed rhythms without fully understanding origins. Ritual preserved structure, while meaning slowly thinned, preventing fixation. The emotional tone here is not loss, but relief. Humanity was never meant to carry the full weight of its past at once. Cycles continue because memory softens. Each era learns what it can handle, then releases the rest. This restraint also protects the world itself. A civilization capable of reproducing an earlier global understanding too quickly might exhaust its environment before learning humility. Limitation forces pacing. It introduces pause. It creates the conditions for wisdom rather than replication. The forgotten civilization, seen through this lens, did not disappear because it failed. It stepped back because it understood the danger of being fully remembered. Its knowledge survives in fragments, shaped to mature alongside those who inherit it. By withholding completeness, it ensured longevity. Knowledge does not break under pressure when it is allowed to change. What survives is not detail, but direction. This realization does not demand certainty. It settles like understanding rather than conclusion. The listener is not pushed toward belief, only toward acceptance of ambiguity as part of the design. If forgetting protects, then remembering becomes responsibility. Knowledge must arrive at the pace of readiness. The past does not rush the future. It waits. As this chapter draws to a close, the story prepares to widen again. The focus shifts from inheritance to consequence. If knowledge was limited by design, then something in the earlier world required restraint. Something triggered withdrawal rather than continuation. The question ahead is not accusatory. It is curious. What happened when memory grew too complete? What pressure caused the earlier cycle to end not in collapse, but in retreat? With that question resting softly, the narrative turns forward once more, leaving certainty behind and following the rhythm that has guided the story all along. The next chapter does not promise answers, only deeper perspective, as history moves closer to its turning points, and the cycle prepares to reveal what comes next. There are moments in history where activity stops without conclusion. Not slowly, not ceremonially, but abruptly, as though time itself hesitated and never fully resumed its rhythm. Across the world, traces of this pause remain. Cities where walls were left unfinished, pathways that lead nowhere, tools resting where hands once held them, as if work was interrupted mid-breath. What is striking is not destruction, but absence of completion. These places do not show the slow decay of abandonment. They show interruption. Construction halts without transition. Traditions end without evolution. Ritual sequences break where continuity should have carried them forward. The story stops without closing its sentence. Silence becomes the evidence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows shock. Something moved through these worlds that made continuation impossible, not because people vanished, but because conditions changed too suddenly to absorb. Adaptation requires time. Whatever happened did not allow it. The narration does not rush toward catastrophe. Instead, it lingers inside the stillness. When complexity disappears everywhere at once, it suggests something more than local failure. The same pattern repeats across vast distances, as if an invisible weight pressed down on memory itself, forcing simplification as the only way forward. Rather than rebuilding immediately, humanity stepped back, not out of choice, but necessity. Systems that required precision gave way to habits that required endurance. Knowledge that demanded explanation softened into stories. Structures that needed maintenance were abandoned for shelters that could be rebuilt anywhere. This shift feels less like collapse and more like compression. Civilization did not end. It folded inward. What remained was what could be carried without effort. Songs instead of scripts. Symbols instead of equations. Memory learned to travel light. The most unsettling possibility arrives quietly. What if the interruption was not only physical, but psychological? What if continuity itself fractured? The ability to remember systems, sequences, and causes may have become overwhelming. Too much awareness, carried through too much disruption, could prevent survival rather than support it. In such conditions, forgetting becomes instinct. Not erasure, but relief. Complexity is dangerous when stability disappears. Simplification allows life to continue when meaning fractures. What was lost was not valued less, but trusted to return later, when pressure eased. This reframing changes how silence is understood. It is not emptiness, but recovery. A pause long enough for humanity to steady itself. The past does not disappear. It becomes unreachable for a time, sealed behind the need to endure. The emotional weight of this moment does not come from tragedy, but from recognition. Humanity may not have forgotten the earlier world because it wanted to move on. It may have forgotten because carrying everything forward was impossible. Memory itself needed rest. That rest leaves marks, gaps where explanation should be, sudden resets where gradual change would feel natural. These are not flaws in the record, but impressions left by interruption. Silence spreads not because nothing happened, but because too much happened too quickly. When the mind cannot integrate experience, it releases what it cannot hold. Civilization continues, but stripped down, simplified, manageable. This understanding invites patience rather than alarm. The record does not accuse, it observes. Humanity passed through something vast enough to reorder priorities at a global scale. What followed was not ignorance, but survival. As the stillness settles, the question naturally shifts. If silence followed something immense, then the story must look upward, outward, or inward to find the pressure that caused it. Not to dramatize disaster, but to understand the kind of force capable of interrupting continuity without erasing humanity. The narrative does not rush forward. It pauses here, inside the quiet, listening to what absence reveals. From this stillness, the next movement emerges gently, seeking the nature of the disruption itself and how it reshaped memory, rhythm, and the fragile thread that ties one age to the next. After the silence settles on the ground, attention drifts upward. Ancient traditions, separated by oceans and centuries, speak quietly of a sky that could no longer be trusted, not with numbers or charts, but with memory. Seasons arrived late or too early. Familiar stars shifted their paths. Cycles that once guided planting, travel, and ceremony began to slip out of rhythm. The heavens, once dependable, became strange. The tone of these accounts is rarely dramatic. There is no language of spectacle. Instead, there is unease, a sense that something foundational had changed. When the sky becomes unfamiliar, time itself loses reliability. Days still pass, but their meaning weakens. Direction becomes uncertain. Identity, once anchored between earth and stars, begins to loosen. For early societies, the sky was not distant, it was intimate. It told people when to move, when to wait, when to gather, and when to rest. When those signals faltered, confusion spread quietly. Agriculture suffers, but more deeply, certainty suffers. The world no longer behaves as expected. This is where fear enters softly, without panic. The fear is not of destruction, but of unpredictability. Humans can endure hardship. What unsettles them is losing reference. When patterns dissolve, attention sharpens, observation becomes survival. In this light, early sky-watching traditions take on a different meaning. They may not have begun in wonder, but in caution. Watching the heavens was no longer curiosity, it was vigilance, a way of checking whether stability had returned, whether rhythm could be trusted again. This changes how ancient astronomy is understood. It becomes less about discovery and more about monitoring. The sky is no longer teacher alone. It is witness. People learn to watch carefully, not to dominate time, but to protect themselves from its surprises. Stories of altered heavens appear again and again, softened into myth, encoded in symbolic language. Fire in the sky, days of darkness, shifting lights. These accounts are rarely precise, but precision is not their purpose. They carry memory of disruption, not measurement. The narration remains hushed because the fear itself was quiet. There was no single moment to name as disaster. Instead, instability lingered, enough to change behavior, enough to leave an impression lasting generations. Whatever happened did not erase knowledge. It changed how knowledge was held. Confidence gave way to caution. Observation became patient. Systems that once assumed regularity learned to expect interruption. This restraint echoes through later cultures. Calendars become sacred rather than casual. Alignments are honored carefully. The sky is approached with respect, not ownership. Watching becomes ritualized, as though attention itself offers protection. The important realization arrives gently. The world did not reset by destroying everything people knew. It reset by teaching them not to assume continuity. Knowledge survived, but it became careful. From this point forward, memory changes shape. What once could be trusted implicitly now must be checked repeatedly. This transforms how knowledge travels. It moves away from certainty and into story. Stories can bend. They can warn without specifying. They can carry fear without recreating it. By embedding sky memories into myth, humanity preserved caution without being overwhelmed by detail. The sky, once unfamiliar, slowly becomes readable again, but never taken for granted. Watching remains part of culture long after danger fades, because memory remembers vulnerability more strongly than safety. As the section draws toward its close, the narrative prepares to descend once more. If the heavens became a source of warning rather than guidance, then those who survived would not store memory in rigid systems. They would encode it differently. What follows is not calculation, but compression. Memory begins to settle into stories, rituals, and symbols that can survive uncertainty. The sky taught humanity restraint, and restraint reshaped how the past was carried forward. With vigilance replacing wonder, the next movement turns toward how survivors learn to remember differently, carrying warning without clarity and knowledge without certainty, into a world still learning how to feel stable again. After disruption, the world does not rebuild itself immediately. It simplifies. What remains is not what mattered most, but what could be carried forward without strain. Survivors do not argue philosophy or preserve detail. They choose what allows life to continue. Everything else waits. Language changes first. Words shorten. Meanings narrow. Sentences lose decoration. What cannot be spoken easily fades from use. Communication becomes direct, efficient, shaped by need rather than expression. Complexity does not vanish because it is unvalued, but because it is heavy. Architecture follows the same pattern. Structures shrink. Permanent buildings give way to shelters that can be razed quickly and abandoned without regret. Stone yields to wood. Monument yields to movement. The goal is not endurance, but flexibility. To stay alive, one must be able to leave. Knowledge adapts accordingly. Anything that requires tools, records, or fragile transmission is set aside. What survives must fit inside memory and body. Songs replace texts. Stories replace explanations. Gestures replace diagrams. Rhythm becomes a storage system, carrying instruction without detail. This compression is not failure. It is strategy. Survival demands lightness. Excess becomes risk. Precision becomes dangerous when conditions change without warning. The earlier world may have been deep and elaborate, but depth becomes weight when stability disappears. The narration lingers here gently, emphasizing compassion rather than loss. Forgetting is no longer framed as tragedy. It becomes mercy. Future generations should not be burdened with knowledge they cannot use or understand. Simplicity offers safety. Symbols emerge because they can hold multiple meanings without breaking. A single image can carry warning, guidance, and memory at once. Myths do not explain, they prepare. They shape intuition rather than logic. In uncertain worlds, intuition survives better than certainty. Ritual becomes essential. Repeated actions ground memory in the body. Even when meaning fades, movement remains. Rhythm carries structure forward when language fails. This is how depth hides inside simplicity, protected until it can be carried again. From the outside, this looks like regression. Tools are lost, knowledge fragments, art becomes sparse. But this interpretation assumes that progress is always the goal. In truth, survival temporarily replaces progress as the highest value. This shift is not permanent, but it is necessary. Humanity learns to move forward by letting go. Not everything deserves to be preserved immediately. Some things must wait until the world can hold them again. The emotional core of this moment is quiet kindness. Those who survived did not abandon knowledge out of ignorance. They shielded those who came after from overload. Memory was shaped to be gentle. In this light, simplification becomes an act of care across generations. A decision made without words. Carry less so others can carry more later. What remains is not emptiness, but readiness. The world becomes small enough to manage. Attention sharpens. Observation returns slowly. As stability increases, memory begins to stretch again. But it does not return unchanged. What re-emerges is altered by compression. Stories grow. Symbols expand. Meaning thickens gradually. Knowledge returns not as it was, but as it must be. This is how cycles breathe. Expansion follows contraction. Remembering follows forgetting. The reset was not meant to erase humanity's past, but to ensure it could continue. As the section closes, the narrative prepares to shift once more. Survival has been achieved. Life steadies. From here, memory does not remain compressed forever. It begins to unfold carefully, reshaped by what it passed through. The next movement follows this slow return. How stories evolve into systems again, how myths harden into structure, how incomplete memory gives rise to new civilizations that feel original, unaware that what they rebuild is guided by fragments shaped during the long night of simplification. With survival secured, the world exhales. And in that exhale, memory quietly begins its work again, altered, cautious, incomplete, but alive. There comes a moment, after survival is secured, when memory needs a new home. Records are precise, but they are fragile. They depend on materials, conditions, and continuity. Stories, by contrast, can bend. They travel easily. They change shape without breaking. When the world becomes uncertain, truth looks for a form that can endure uncertainty with it. This is how story takes over, not as entertainment, but as shelter. What was once lived directly begins to soften into narrative. Experience turns into symbol. Memory learns how to hide inside meaning rather than detail. The facts may fracture, but the core remains intact. In this transition, nothing is lost suddenly. It is gradual and almost tender. A flood remembered clearly by one generation becomes a warning story in the next. Eventually, it becomes myth. Not because the event was exaggerated, but because compression allowed it to survive when explanation no longer could. Teachers who once walked among people slowly rise into something more than human, not to glorify them, but to protect their role from being questioned or forgotten. Stories are living things. They adapt themselves to the needs of those who carry them. When clarity is possible, they sharpen. When danger returns, they simplify. They preserve emotional truth when literal truth would overwhelm or fail to translate. In this way, stories become more durable than records ever could be. Stone cracks. Pages burn. Oral memory reshapes itself to remain useful. A story that cannot change will die. One that bends will continue. This bending is not dishonesty. It is intelligence responding to time. Cycles that were once observed directly turn into moral lessons. Astronomical shifts become tales of gods and judgment. Knowledge that once required precision becomes guidance encoded in emotion. The listener may not know exactly what happened, but they feel what matters. Fear, caution, humility, respect. These survive long after measurements are lost. The lullaby tone of this transformation matters. Myth does not shout truth. It hums it. It settles into the subconscious, where memory lasts longer. Children hear these stories long before they can analyze them. Meaning enters quietly, shaping intuition instead of belief. This is the gentle reveal. Mythology is not exaggeration, it is compression. It allows vast, complex experience to fit inside human memory without tearing it apart. What was once lived becomes symbolic so it can survive longer than truth alone. In this form, memory becomes almost invisible. It no longer looks like history. It feels like tradition. It stops asking to be examined and starts asking to be repeated. Ritual becomes remembrance without explanation, a way of carrying the past forward without reopening wounds. Yet compression comes with consequence. As stories bend, details shift. emphasis changes. Some meanings fade while others strengthen. Over time, control enters quietly. Stories are told differently depending on who speaks them and why. Still, this was the safest path. To preserve everything exactly would have been impossible. To preserve something was necessary. Story offered that balance. It could survive error, misinterpretation, and distance. It could cross generations even when understanding could not. The choice of story over record was not accidental. It was adaptive. It ensured memory would endure long enough to matter again. Even distorted, it was better than silence. As this section draws to rest, a subtle tension appears. Stories protect memory, but they also reshape it. What survives is powerful, but no longer neutral. As narratives gain authority, they begin to guide behavior, belief, and identity. With that shift, the next question rises naturally. If memory survived as story, then distortion was inevitable. And where distortion gathers, influence follows. The narrative is now ready to explore how stories, once created to protect truth, slowly became tools that could shape power itself. As stability slowly returns, something else begins to take shape alongside shelter, rhythm, and routine. Memory, once carried simply to survive, starts to settle into position. Stories are no longer just repeated, they are selected. Some are told more often, others are allowed to fade. Not through malice, but through usefulness. In rebuilding societies, order becomes precious. Consistency matters. Shared understanding holds people together. In that environment, memory stops being fluid and begins to harden. Myth turns into identity. Identity turns into structure. What a group remembers begins to define who belongs, what is valued, and how life should be lived. This shift does not arrive with violence or deceit. It arrives quietly, as organization always does. Certain stories help explain the present, others complicate it. Those that support stability are repeated. Those that raise uncomfortable questions are set aside, not erased, simply unattended. Over time, neglect does the work of forgetting. The narration remains neutral here, because this process is not a conspiracy, it is a pattern. When people come together to build lasting systems, they need shared ground. Memory provides that ground, but only when shaped into something solid. Ambiguity weakens authority. Certainty strengthens it. As myths grow central, interpretation begins to matter. Who tells the story gains influence. Who decides which version is correct gains power. Memory becomes less about what happened and more about what should be remembered. The past transforms from experience into instruction. At this point, the forgotten civilization recedes further into the background. Not because it is denied, but because it no longer fits. Its message of restraint, cycles, and disappearance offers little help in maintaining order. It speaks of letting go, while societies now need rules, boundaries, and permanence. Survival has turned into hierarchy. Roles solidify, leadership emerges. With it comes the need for justification. Memory provides legitimacy when framed correctly. Stories that once protected humanity now begin to govern it. The quiet twist unfolds here. The forgotten civilization was not pushed away. It was outgrown, or perhaps more accurately, it was outpaced. Its influence becomes too subtle for a world focused on structure and expansion. Silence replaces relevance. This does not mean its ideas vanish completely. They linger beneath the surface, influencing values indirectly, but they are no longer central. Memory reshapes itself around what helps the present function, not what once guided withdrawal or balance. The calmness of this transition is important. Power does not announce itself. It accumulates through repetition, through ritual, through agreed narratives that simplify complexity into something manageable. Over time, these narratives feel inevitable. Once memory becomes authority, questioning it feels dangerous. Not because the past is sacred, but because stability depends on it. This encourages reverence rather than curiosity. Preservation replaces exploration. Forgetting, now, is no longer accidental. It becomes structural. Entire layers of experience fade because they do not serve current needs. They are not wrong, they are simply unnecessary. This is how the forgotten civilization continues to disappear without being destroyed. Its message remains encoded, but inaccessible. It waits beneath identities shaped by memory that favors control over cycles. The listener is invited to observe this without judgment. Every civilization does this. Memory bends toward usefulness. What survives is not what is truest, but what holds society together. Yet something is lost in this process. Not knowledge itself, but flexibility. When memory hardens into authority, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. The idea of stepping aside, of intentional withdrawal, feels unnatural in a world built on continuation. As this realization settles, a deeper pattern becomes visible. Forgetting is no longer personal or accidental. It is built into systems. It lives inside law, tradition, and belief. Civilization moves forward by narrowing what it remembers. This prepares the narrative to move again. If memory reshaped authority, then forgetting became foundational. It was woven into civilization itself, not as failure, but as function. The next movement follows this thread inward, exploring how distance grows between lived experience and inherited story. How the past becomes unreachable, not because it is hidden, but because structures no longer allow access. With authority established, memory becomes selective, and silence becomes permanent. The forgotten civilization remains present only as faint pressure beneath the surface, waiting for moments when structure loosens and curiosity returns. That moment does not arrive yet. For now, the story rests inside this balance, where order depends on memory, and memory depends on forgetting, shaping the long arc of civilization in ways few ever stop to notice. As time continues its quiet work, distance grows in ways that cannot be measured by years alone. Generations pass, and the earlier world begins to lose its relevance, not because it is forbidden, but because it no longer fits. Its lessons feel heavy, its language outdated, its rhythm out of sync with the needs of the present. What was once guidance becomes atmosphere. The forgotten civilization does not disappear suddenly. It drifts. Its presence fades into the background of culture, becoming something felt but rarely examined. Its influence remains, but only as tone, as mood, as a subtle shaping of values that no longer point clearly to their source. Memory softens until it no longer demands interpretation. This is the final separation. The past is not hidden away or destroyed. It rests where attention no longer lingers. People move forward without needing to look back, because forward motion is now sustained by structure, not recollection. The foundations are firm enough that origins no longer feel necessary. The narration does not treat this as loss, it is closer to release. Every civilization eventually reaches a point where its past becomes too distant to consult directly. Lessons no longer translate cleanly into new circumstances. What once guided survival becomes irrelevant to stability. The world has changed, and memory must either adapt or fall silent. Myth becomes background noise. Stories remain, but stripped of urgency. Symbols persist, but without pressure. They are referenced without curiosity, respected without understanding. The past exists as texture rather than instruction. This creates a calm stillness. The forgotten civilization no longer asks to be solved or recovered. It has finished shaping what came next. Humanity carries forward what it can use, leaving the rest to rest undisturbed. The cycle does not erase the past, it outgrows it. The emotional tone here is serene. There is no tragedy in distance. The past is not abandoned. It is allowed to sleep. What shaped the present does not need to be constantly revisited to remain effective. Influence lingers, even when memory fades. In this quiet, the earlier world becomes unreachable, not because access is denied, but because the path no longer matters. The questions it answered are no longer the questions being asked. Curiosity turns elsewhere. Yet something subtle remains. A sense of depth beneath routine. A feeling that the present is built on layers it no longer recognizes. The shadow of the past stretches faintly across the current moment, barely noticeable unless one pauses long enough to feel it. This shadow does not instruct, it watches. It offers no warning, only presence. Most pass through it without awareness. A few sense it and move on without naming it. The forgotten civilization rests here, neither alive nor gone. It exists as pressure without voice, memory without access, not guiding, not interfering, simply present. And so humanity continues, confident in its structures, secure in its systems, unaware that distance itself has become part of the design. The past cannot be touched, because it no longer needs to be. As this chapter closes, the story does not feel finished. It feels paused. A cycle stabilized long enough to forget its origins. This sets the stage for the question that follows naturally, without urgency or fear. If forgetting once allowed survival, and distance once allowed stability, then another forgetting is not impossible. It may even be inevitable. The narrative prepares to widen again, to look not backward, but around, toward patterns repeating softly, toward rhythms resurfacing unnoticed. The past has become a shadow, and shadows only matter when the light begins to shift. Modern life is built on the assumption of forward motion. The future is imagined as a destination never reached before, and the past as something left behind, incapable of returning. Progress moves in one direction, and time is treated like a straight road, stretching endlessly ahead. Yet this way of seeing time is not ancient. It is relatively new, shaped by confidence in permanence and control. Earlier cultures did not experience time this way. They did not picture history as a line. They felt it as a rhythm. Days followed nights. Seasons returned without effort. Growth gave way to decay, which made space for renewal. Nothing moved endlessly forward. Everything circled back, changed, and continued. This understanding did not come from philosophy or abstraction. It came from watching. The sky repeated its patterns. The land rested and revived. Human life followed similar arcs of emergence, expansion, decline, and rest. Time was not something to conquer. It was something to move within. The narration does not argue this idea. It invites the listener to feel it. Repetition becomes familiar rather than alarming. Endings lose their finality. Beginnings lose their urgency. Everything participates in a larger motion that cannot be rushed or halted. In this worldview, cycles are not symbolic. They are descriptive. What appears as collapse is simply a transition between phases. What appears as failure is part of rhythm. History does not march. It breathes. Civilizations rise, not to stay forever, but to fulfill a phase of expression. They grow dense, complex, confident, then slowly release that density. Attention shifts. Energy redistributes. Withdrawal follows expansion, just as rest follows exertion. Nothing here is random. This idea carries a quiet comfort. If repetition is structure rather than mistake, then humanity has not fallen once. It has moved through many turns of the same pattern. What feels unprecedented may be familiar at a deeper level, even if memory cannot reach it clearly. Ancient cultures often expected the future to resemble the past, not in detail, but in feeling. They anticipated renewal after decline and calm after upheaval. This expectation did not produce anxiety. It produced patience. The modern fear of collapse is rooted in the belief that time only moves forward. If progress stops, meaning ends. But in a cyclical view, stopping is part of continuation. Rest is not regression. Silence is not erasure. This reframing does not deny suffering or loss. It places them inside a pattern that continues regardless of individual outcome. Collapse is not romanticized. It is contextualized. It becomes one phase among many. The quiet reveal arrives without announcement. Perhaps history has already passed through moments like this. Perhaps what feels final is temporary, and what feels stable is transitional. The cycle does not care whether it is named or believed. It continues. The tone remains calm, because cycles do not hurry. They do not panic. They proceed at their own pace, indifferent to human expectation. Humanity learns this slowly, forgetting and rediscovering it across ages. This idea keeps returning because it cannot be erased. Even when societies insist on linear progress, cyclical patterns reassert themselves through experience. Growth reaches limits, complexity strains. Simplification follows. The rhythm repeats. To see this is not to surrender agency. It is to recognize structure. When patterns are recognized, fear loosens its grip. The unknown becomes navigable, not because it is controlled, but because it is familiar. As this understanding settles, the story widens. If time itself repeats, then civilizations are not isolated events. They are expressions of the same rhythm, shaped by conditions, but guided by a deeper motion. This prepares the narrative to move outward again. The next step is not to examine time abstractly, but to watch how entire societies echo one another across centuries. If cycles govern existence, then history should rhyme, even when names and places change. With this realization resting softly, the listener is guided toward the next movement, where repetition becomes visible not in ideas alone, but in the mirrored rise and fall of civilizations shaped by the same underlying breath of time. When history is viewed in fragments, each civilization feels unique, sealed inside its own time and place. But when the view widens, patterns begin to repeat with unsettling familiarity. Societies, separated by oceans and centuries, often move through the same stages, shaped not by shared memory, but by shared pressure. The narration does not point fingers or list examples. It allows recognition to arise naturally. Stability follows survival. With stability comes growth. With growth comes structure. Structure brings hierarchy, and hierarchy introduces distance between people and power. Over time, connection thins. Systems grow complex enough to replace relationships. The rhythm is quiet but consistent. At first, expansion feels like success. Infrastructure strengthens, knowledge accumulates, organization brings comfort. Yet beneath that comfort, flexibility begins to fade. Systems that once served, people start demanding service in return. Rules multiply, maintenance replaces curiosity. Growth continues, but its purpose becomes less clear. As distance increases, cohesion weakens. Decisions move farther from daily life. Identity becomes abstract. Trust shifts from people to structures. When pressure returns, adaptation slows. The system resists change, because change threatens stability itself. These stages are not mistakes, they are consequences. Human organization follows predictable stress points. When populations grow beyond shared memory, efficiency replaces intimacy. When efficiency dominates, nuance disappears. This is not failure. It is gravity acting on complexity. The emotional turn arrives gently. These phases feel familiar because they are familiar, not because they were studied in detail, but because they are experienced. Humanity recognizes itself in earlier cycles without needing comparison. The pattern does not shock. It resonates. Civilizations of the past may have reached points we recognize uncomfortably well. Moments when expansion could no longer solve internal strain, when growth itself became the burden. These societies did not always collapse in fire. Some stalled, some fragmented, some simplified. The tone remains calm because cycles do not accuse. They describe. There is no villain here, no singular mistake to avoid, only motion following form. When complexity exceeds integration, release follows. Understanding this does not demand alarm. Awareness changes the feeling entirely. If repetition is structural, then it is not something to fear. It can be observed, navigated, even respected. Patterns lose their threat when they are named quietly. The rise and fall of civilizations becomes less dramatic when seen as breath. Expansion inhales, contraction exhales. Neither is moral, both are necessary. Trying to inhale forever is not ambition. It is imbalance. This reframing softens judgment. Past societies did not fail because they were less intelligent or less prepared. They reached the natural limits of their form. Their decline does not condemn them. It completes them. The forgotten civilization enters this realization gently. Perhaps it recognized these phases earlier than others. Perhaps awareness arrived before pressure forced collapse. If so, withdrawal would not be surrender, but choice. This possibility removes catastrophe from the center of the story. Endings no longer require disaster. Awareness itself can signal transition. When a civilization understands its position in the cycle, it may step aside without noise. That idea lingers without insistence. It does not rewrite history. It reframes it. What looks like disappearance may have been comprehension. What feels like loss may have been restraint. As the section settles, the listener is not pushed toward conclusion, only toward recognition. Patterns repeat because they are expressions of deeper rhythm. Civilizations rhyme because they are shaped by the same pressures, responding differently but predictably. With this recognition, curiosity shifts again. If societies move through recognizable phases, then the forgotten civilization may not have ended in chaos at all. It may have ended in understanding. The narrative prepares to follow that thought inward, toward the moment when awareness interrupts momentum, toward the possibility that the greatest change occurs not at collapse, but at clarity. The next movement does not search for failure, it listens for recognition. There may come a moment in the life of a civilization when momentum pauses without force. Expansion slows not because resources are exhausted or enemies advance, but because awareness arrives. The future does not close suddenly. It reveals itself clearly enough to be recognized. This is a rare moment, one that history does not often record, because it leaves so little behind. Awareness does not need monuments. It does not announce itself with victory or defeat. It simply alters direction. Growth loses urgency. Continuation becomes a question rather than a rule. The narration treats this possibility with quiet respect. A civilization capable of recognizing its own trajectory has already reached an unusual level of understanding. It can see the cycle it participates in. It can sense where expansion leads if left unchecked. It can feel the weight of repetition before repetition becomes necessity. In this light, the forgotten civilization may have understood itself earlier than others. Instead of pushing forward until collapse forced retreat, it may have chosen restraint while choice was still possible. This reframes disappearance entirely. It is no longer abandonment or failure. It becomes graduation. To step back intentionally requires more than intelligence. It requires honesty. It asks a civilization to recognize not only its power, but its limits. To accept that dominance does not equal completion, and that permanence is not the measure of success. The emotional tone here is contemplative, because the idea itself is humbling. Awareness is the rarest achievement. Most societies move until resistance stops them. Very few stop because they understand where they are headed. This understanding may arrive quietly. Patterns align, signals repeat, pressure builds slowly. At some point, expansion begins to feel hollow. Growth no longer adds meaning. Complexity strains coherence. When these sensations are noticed rather than ignored, awareness begins. The decision that follows does not need consensus. It unfolds gradually. Priorities shift. Visibility decreases. Influence disperses. Knowledge is allowed to fragment rather than consolidate. Identity softens. What once needed to be protected is released. Withdrawal, in this sense, is not retreat from fear. It is movement informed by clarity. The civilization does not resist change. It embraces completion. What it carried has been given. What it built has served its purpose. This moment is easily misunderstood from the outside. Those who come later see absence and assume loss. They see silence and assume erasure. But silence can be the result of understanding rather than catastrophe. The deepest reveal of this chapter settles here. The highest stage of civilization may not be dominance, but restraint. Not continuation, but recognition. Not survival at all costs, but knowing when the cost becomes too high. This idea challenges modern instincts without accusing them. It offers an alternative measure of success, one that values awareness over endurance. A civilization does not need to last forever to complete its role. Seen this way, disappearance becomes an act of wisdom. The civilization does not wait to be broken by the cycle. It steps aside while balance is still possible. It trusts that what follows will find its own path, guided quietly by what has already been given. There is calm in this ending. No urgency, no regret, only the sense that something has finished what it came to do. The cycle continues, not because the past failed, but because it understood. As this realization settles, the narrative begins to turn outward again. Awareness is no longer confined to ancient worlds. The question shifts gently toward the present, without blame or warning. If civilizations can recognize themselves, then awareness is not limited to the past. The listener is not asked to judge or predict, only to observe. Clarity does not arrive loudly. It emerges when attention slows enough to notice patterns repeating. With cycles and awareness established, the story prepares to meet the present moment, not as accusation, not as prophecy, but as curiosity. The possibility lingers quietly, inviting reflection. What happens when understanding arrives before collapse? And whether, this time, recognition might be felt again, not as ending, but as choice. There is a feeling that settles quietly into the present moment, difficult to name but easy to recognize. It does not announce itself as danger or promise. It hums beneath daily life, like a vibration too steady to ignore. Things move faster than before. Information multiplies. Connections stretch across the world instantly. And yet, a curious sense of thinning accompanies this acceleration, as though meaning has not kept pace with motion. The narration does not point to events or dates. It stays with sensation. Complexity grows denser, but coherence feels fragile. Systems expand, yet understanding feels scattered. Communication increases, while solitude deepens. Knowledge accumulates, but certainty retreats. These contradictions are not new in feeling. They carry a familiarity that resists explanation. This familiarity does not come from memory in the usual sense. There is no clear reference point, no lesson recalled from a book or story. Instead, the recognition is emotional. The present does not feel unprecedented. It feels patterned, like a stage already visited, though never consciously remembered. The tone remains calm because resonance is not crisis. The sensation does not warn of catastrophe. It invites awareness. What is felt now echoes earlier phases described quietly throughout the story. Expansion, fragmentation, distance between structure and lived experience. These stages do not shout. They unfold gradually, becoming noticeable only when attention slows. Connectivity creates reach, but also blur. Boundaries soften, roles multiply. Identity becomes layered. With each addition, clarity thins slightly, meaning struggles to anchor itself. This is not failure. It is consequence. The same pressures that shaped earlier civilizations shape the present, adjusted for scale but familiar in motion. What makes this moment unusual is not its content, but its timing. The cycle does not repeat exactly, yet the rhythm remains intact. Awareness grows alongside complexity, allowing sensation to be noticed before rupture arrives. This is not foresight, it is recognition. The quiet reveal arrives personally. The listener is no longer observing history from distance, they are participating in it. The same pressures once inferred from ruins and stories are now felt internally, as restlessness, acceleration, and subtle disconnection. The past does not feel distant, it feels present. This realization does not demand fear, it offers context. When experiences feel familiar without explanation, they often belong to patterns larger than individual lives. The cycle breathes through generations, and each iteration carries its own version of the same sensations. The narration avoids urgency because urgency obscures clarity. Nothing here demands immediate response. Awareness itself is enough. The feeling of repetition is not a prediction. It is an invitation to observe without panic. The present moment becomes a mirror, reflecting not specific histories, but structure. What once required ruins to study now unfolds in real time. The cycle does not ask to be stopped, it asks to be noticed. In noticing, fear softens. Patterns lose mystery. The question is no longer whether this moment is unique, but how it fits. Familiarity becomes grounding rather than unsettling. The section rests here, allowing the listener to sit inside recognition without interpretation. The present echoes earlier phases not because it is doomed, but because it is human. Cycles repeat because conditions repeat. Awareness is the variable. As this awareness settles, curiosity shifts gently again. If the present mirrors earlier phases, then understanding how those phases resolved becomes relevant. Not to predict outcomes, but to sense possibility. The story does not rush forward. It pauses inside familiarity, letting the feeling speak for itself. The next question forms naturally, without pressure or warning. If humanity has been here before, then how memory responded then may matter now. From this quiet recognition, the narrative prepares to explore whether remembering past cycles has ever changed their course, and whether awareness itself can alter what repetition usually produces when left unseen. Progress, in the present moment, moves with remarkable speed. Ideas appear, spread, and transform before they can fully settle. Innovation stacks upon innovation, each layer promising improvement, efficiency, connection. The motion itself feels powerful, almost inevitable. Yet beneath that power, something quieter begins to thin. Attention shortens. Integration lags behind invention, meaning struggles to keep up with movement. The narration does not judge this condition. It observes it. Progress is not framed as error or excess. It is simply fast. Faster than reflection, faster than rest, faster than the time required to absorb what has already changed. Advancement accelerates, while memory remains shallow. This imbalance is not new. It echoes an earlier phase described throughout the story. When systems grow quicker than the ability to integrate them, complexity becomes fragile. Not because it is wrong, but because it has not been digested. Growth without pause creates density without cohesion. What weakens civilizations is not speed itself, but the absence of rest. Rest is where understanding forms. Without it, knowledge accumulates without becoming wisdom. Innovation multiplies, but insight scatters. The structure expands, but the foundation does not deepen. This moment feels familiar because it has occurred before. Earlier civilizations reached points where growth outpaced reflection. Complexity rose faster than integration. At that threshold, fragility emerged, not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of pause. The forgotten civilization re-enters the narrative quietly here, not as mystery, but as comparison. Perhaps it recognized this point. Perhaps awareness arrived before brittleness became collapse. Instead of continuing blindly, it slowed. Instead of expanding endlessly, it withdrew. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. This possibility reframes progress itself. Advancement does not require constant acceleration. It requires rhythm. Movement followed by stillness. Expansion followed by consolidation. When that rhythm breaks, imbalance grows. The tone remains neutral, because this is not accusation. It is pattern. Modern life is not uniquely flawed. It is navigating pressures inherent to complexity. The question is not whether progress should stop, but whether it can listen. Without memory, progress forgets its own weight. It builds quickly, assuming strength, unaware of brittleness beneath speed. Memory provides friction. It slows movement just enough for integration to occur. The absence of memory does not feel dramatic. It feels busy. It feels full. Yet beneath that fullness, something essential is missing. Time to absorb. Space to reflect. Distance enough to understand. Civilizations do not fall because they grow too fast. They falter because they forget how to rest. Rest is not absence of action. It is presence of awareness. It is the moment when growth pauses long enough to become something stable. The forgotten civilization may have understood this. Its withdrawal begins to look less like disappearance and more like correction. A return to rhythm before imbalance hardened into collapse. This comparison does not suggest inevitability. It suggests choice. Awareness introduces options where momentum assumes only continuation. The listener is not asked to fear, speed, or reject progress, only to notice how motion feels when memory cannot keep pace. To sense the brittleness beneath acceleration, not as threat, but as signal. As this realization settles, the narrative gently approaches its final question. If memory once guided restraint, then awareness now may still matter, not to stop the cycle, but to move through it consciously. The present does not demand panic. It invites listening. The same listening that once guided withdrawal may still be available. The story does not yet conclude. It rests here, inside observation. Progress continues. Complexity grows. But awareness, once recognized, does not disappear easily. With this awareness, the narrative prepares for its closing movement. The final question does not ask what will happen next. It asks whether humanity can still hear the quiet signals that once guided others to slow down before speed became collapse. The cycle continues either way, but listening changes how it is experienced. And with that possibility hovering softly, the story prepares to move toward its final reflection, where choice, rest, and remembrance begin to share the same quiet space once more. There is a moment when movement pauses without stopping. Nothing collapses, nothing resolves, the world simply holds its breath. This moment feels suspended, balanced between continuation and repetition, between momentum and recognition. It does not demand action, it invites awareness. Humanity, in this moment, does not stand at the edge of disaster or salvation. It stands at a threshold, a place others have reached before, not identical in detail, but familiar in sensation. The pressure feels known. The questions feel quiet rather than urgent. Something essential is being noticed. The narration remains still, resisting the instinct to predict or warn. The cycle does not announce endings in advance. It reveals crossroads. What happens next depends less on external force and more on how awareness is held. The forgotten civilization no longer feels distant here. It is not myth, not mystery, not lesson carved into stone. It becomes a mirror, not to replicate its choices, but to recognize the shape of the moment it once faced. The similarities do not accuse. They resonate. This resonance carries a calm that is almost hopeful. Cycles are not traps. They are structures that allow choice to matter. A loop does not force repetition. It offers recognition. When a threshold is seen, movement does not have to remain unconscious. Standing here, humanity is neither doomed nor saved. Those are extremes that belong to linear stories. Cycles move differently. They allow pause. They allow reflection. They allow withdrawal as much as continuation. The emotional weight of this realization is gentle. There is no urgency to decide everything at once. Awareness does not rush. It settles. It listens. At this threshold, the present does not compete with the past. It aligns with it. What once required ruins and myths to understand is now felt directly inside lived experience. Acceleration, complexity, fragmentation, and awareness coexist. None dominate yet. The cycle has brought humanity to a familiar point. But familiarity does not equal inevitability. The forgotten civilization did not disappear because the cycle demanded destruction. It may have stepped back because awareness allowed it. This possibility reframes the present moment. Choice is no longer dramatic. It is subtle. It appears in pacing, in restraint, in the willingness to rest instead of expand automatically. The story does not suggest solutions. It does not prescribe withdrawal or continuation. It simply observes that awareness creates space. Space where repetition can be softened. Space where rhythm can be restored. Standing at the same threshold does not mean repeating the same outcome. It means recognizing the shape of decision before momentum decides for us. That recognition alone changes how the cycle is experienced. The calm here matters. When fear is removed, clarity becomes possible. Cycles are not enemies. They are invitations to participate consciously in motion that would otherwise carry everything forward without pause. The forgotten civilization fades again, not because it is irrelevant, but because it has already offered what it could. A reflection, a possibility. A reminder that disappearance does not always mean failure, and continuation does not always mean success. This chapter closes in stillness, because stillness is the point. Nothing needs to happen yet. Awareness itself is the turning. As the narrative prepares to move toward its final chapters, the focus shifts from history and pattern to choice and presence. What does it mean to remember without recovering? To withdraw without vanishing? To continue without accelerating? The story does not end here. It deepens. With the present aligned to the past, the next movement can explore what quiet choice might look like now. Not as prophecy, not as instruction, but as reflection. The threshold remains. It does not close. It waits. And in that waiting, something rare becomes possible. There is a quiet expectation many people carry, often without realizing it. The hope that somewhere beneath the surface of the world, a forgotten civilization waits to be uncovered. That one day, enough evidence will be found, enough pieces assembled, and the past will rise again, restored to clarity. This hope is understandable. It promises resolution. It suggests that what was lost can be recovered, corrected, or completed. The narration does not reject this hope abruptly. It softens it. It invites a gentler understanding. Some things are not meant to return, not because they were destroyed, but because they finished what they came to do. The forgotten civilization was not interrupted mid-sentence. It reached its conclusion and let go of continuation. In this light, disappearance is not absence, it is release. The civilization did not leave itself unfinished for future generations to solve. It stepped away precisely so it would not be followed, imitated, or revived out of context. To return fully would undo the balance it chose to preserve. Civilizations are not designed to repeat themselves exactly. Each cycle carries forward impressions, not blueprints. Traces move onward. Structures remain behind. What survives is influence, not instruction. Attempting to resurrect the past misunderstands its purpose, turning wisdom into imitation. The narration emphasizes this without urgency. The past does not need to be corrected. It does not wait for discovery. It rests because it has nothing left to amend. Returning would not add clarity. It would reintroduce weight that no longer belongs. There is relief in this realization. The burden of recovery lifts. Humanity is no longer responsible for restoring what came before. The past does not ask to be finished. It asks to be allowed its rest. This perspective reframes loss into closure. The civilization did not vanish because it failed. It withdrew because repetition was no longer necessary. What it offered has already been absorbed into the world in subtler ways. When people search for lost civilizations, they often imagine hidden cities or buried technologies. Yet the deepest wisdom rarely hides in objects. It dissolves into pattern, into timing, into restraint. It becomes invisible by design. To return would require reassembling fragments that were intentionally scattered. It would collapse distance that was meant to grow. It would harden what was deliberately softened. The past understood that presence has a lifespan. This understanding allows the listener to release longing without disappointment. The desire for rediscovery fades into appreciation. What matters is not uncovering everything, but recognizing what remains active without being visible. Civilizations, like individuals, complete phases of growth and understanding. Once complete, continuation becomes unnecessary. Completion does not require applause or remembrance. It requires space. The forgotten civilization left that space. It did not linger as monument or instruction. It trusted the future to unfold without it. That trust is part of its legacy. The emotional tone here is quiet acceptance. There is nothing tragic about finality when it is chosen consciously. The past does not haunt the present. It supports it quietly by not returning. This realization shifts attention. Instead of looking backward for recovery, awareness turns inward and outward. Influence does not travel as replicas. It arrives as orientation, as subtle pressure shaping decisions without announcing itself. If the past does not return, then its presence must be felt rather than found. It must guide without showing itself. It must shape without instructing. This is the kind of wisdom that endures. As this section settles, the narrative prepares to move again, not toward excavation, but toward recognition. The past rests where it belongs. What moves forward is not history revived, but insight carried quietly into the present, waiting to be noticed in forms that do not ask to be named. What survives a civilization is rarely what it explains. Tools may remain, patterns may repeat, sensibilities linger, but instructions are absent. This absence is not a mistake. It is deliberate. The forgotten civilization did not leave behind manuals for living or precise guides for rebuilding what once existed. It offered something quieter. Frameworks without commentary. Insights without enforcement. Traces without ownership. What remained was not certainty, but invitation. Knowledge delivered too clearly tends to harden. It becomes rigid, defended, copied without question. When instructions are fixed, growth narrows into imitation. Wisdom behaves differently. It resists clarity long enough to require participation. Without directions, meaning must be rediscovered rather than followed. Each generation, then, arrives at familiar insights on its own. Balance matters. Excess carries cost. Humility preserves continuity. These truths appear again and again, not because humanity forgets them entirely, but because they must be learned firsthand to matter. Repetition is not failure, it is independence. The narration lingers here gently, reframing recurrence as design rather than flaw. What feels like rediscovery is actually capacity reawakening. The lesson is not the content of knowledge, but the ability to sense when it applies. This is the quiet reveal. The true legacy of the forgotten civilization was not information, it was capacity. The ability to feel thresholds, to notice when growth becomes excess. When connection turns into noise, when accumulation stops serving coherence. Such capacity cannot be handed down directly. It must emerge through experience. Instructions would only interfere. By withholding guidance, the civilization trusted future societies to develop their own sensitivity, shaped by conditions that could not be predicted in advance. This trust required restraint. It meant accepting distortion, misinterpretation, and delay. But it also ensured relevance. Meaning that must be rediscovered adapts naturally to context. It bends without breaking. It remains alive. Humanity's repeated return to similar principles begins to look intentional through this lens. The cycle does not demand obedience, it invites awareness. Each era learns balance in its own language, through its own mistakes, guided by an inherited capacity rather than a borrowed script. The absence of instruction also prevents dependence. No generation is bound to the past for answers. The forgotten civilization does not linger as authority. It recedes fully, allowing successors to claim responsibility for understanding rather than seeking approval. This is a form of generosity often overlooked. To give without explanation requires confidence. It assumes the receiver is capable of learning. It accepts that insight gained slowly is more stable than insight granted quickly. In this light, forgetting becomes part of the gift. When memory softens, intuition sharpens. The world becomes teacher again. Observation replaces doctrine. Experience fills the gap left by missing instructions. The listener is not asked to admire the forgotten civilization for its intelligence. It is its restraint that stands out. Knowing what not to leave behind may be its greatest achievement. As this understanding settles, attention shifts inward. If no instructions were given, then remembering becomes personal. It no longer depends on excavation or discovery. It depends on sensitivity, awareness, and timing. The past does not reappear as answer. It reappears as capacity awakened within the present. When conditions align, insight surfaces naturally, without needing to be justified by origin. This prepares the transition ahead. The story moves away from objects and artifacts entirely. What remains cannot be unearthed with tools. It must be recognized internally. If the inheritance was capacity rather than instruction, then remembrance is not archaeological. It is experiential. It occurs in moments of restraint, in choices to pause, in the recognition of rhythm. The forgotten civilization left behind no directions because directions would have limited what could grow. Instead, it offered space. And in that space, humanity continues to rediscover what it needs, exactly when it is ready. The narrative rests here briefly, allowing this idea to settle. The gift has already been given. It does not ask to be claimed. It waits quietly within attention itself, shaping the next movement not through memory recalled, but through awareness felt, ready to guide without ever revealing where it came from. Remembering is often imagined as an act of retrieval. Something lost must be found. Something broken must be restored. The past is treated like a structure that collapsed too soon, waiting patiently to be rebuilt. Yet this expectation misunderstands what remembrance is capable of holding. The forgotten civilization does not ask to be reconstructed. Its absence is not an error that needs correction. To rebuild it would be to misunderstand its ending, turning completion into repetition. What mattered was never the form it took, but the awareness it carried. Remembering, in this deeper sense, does not point backward. It moves inward. It does not require artifacts, texts, or recovered knowledge. It lives in recognition rather than recall. In the ability to sense pattern without naming it. In the quiet understanding of timing, limit, and rhythm. The narration settles into stillness here. There is no instruction to act, only permission to notice. The echoes of the past do not arrive as information. They arrive as moments. A feeling that growth has reached its edge. An intuition that something does not need to continue simply because it can. A calm awareness that rest is not failure. These moments are easy to overlook. They do not announce themselves as wisdom. They feel ordinary. A pause before speaking. A decision not to pursue what once felt necessary. A willingness to let something end without force or regret. In these choices, memory lives quietly. This is how the forgotten civilization remains present without returning. Its influence survives as restraint, as sensitivity to balance, as the ability to step back when momentum urges forward. No monuments are required, no names need to be remembered. Memory becomes intuition rather than data. It does not accumulate. It responds. It adjusts to context without needing to justify itself through history. This makes it resilient. Intuition cannot be erased because it adapts continuously. The tone remains serene because this kind of remembrance brings peace, not urgency. There is nothing to recover, nothing missing. Awareness is already present, waiting only for attention. Late at night, when the world grows quiet, this recognition feels closer. Without distraction, patterns emerge naturally. The listener may notice how cycles repeat within personal experience. Periods of intensity followed by exhaustion. Moments when continuation feels wrong, even if success is possible. These are small reflections of a larger rhythm. Honoring the forgotten civilization does not mean studying it endlessly. It means embodying what it understood, knowing when to stop, knowing when to release, knowing when growth no longer adds meaning. This reframes remembrance entirely. It is not about preserving the past. It is about living with awareness shaped by it. The past has already done its work. It does not need to be summoned again. Restraint becomes the quiet language of memory. Limits become guidance rather than restriction. Endings become natural rather than tragic. In this way, remembering feels less like holding on and more like letting go at the right moment. The emotional insight arrives softly. Remembrance lives not in books, ruins, or recovered knowledge, but in choices shaped by awareness. When restraint replaces compulsion, memory is active. The forgotten civilization rests because it is already present in this capacity. It does not demand reverence. It does not wait for rediscovery. It lives inside attention itself, ready to guide gently without revealing its face. As this section closes, the view begins to widen naturally. Memory no longer belongs solely to civilization. It extends beyond human history, into patterns that shape existence itself. With remembrance reframed as awareness rather than recovery, the narrative prepares to step back even further, beyond societies, beyond cycles of culture, towards something quieter and more encompassing. The story is ready to look beyond humanity, not to escape it, but to place it gently within a larger motion, where remembering and letting go are no longer opposites, but part of the same calm rhythm that has always been moving, patiently, underneath everything. From far enough away, civilizations no longer look like permanent achievements. They begin to resemble shapes formed briefly in motion, patterns that rise, hold, and dissolve as consciousness moves through time. What feels solid from within becomes fluid when viewed at scale. Nothing here is erased. Nothing is owned. Everything passes through. The narration invites a widening of perspective. Just as weather shapes clouds without claiming them, awareness shapes civilizations without holding them forever. A culture forms, develops structure, gathers meaning, then slowly releases its form. The substance does not vanish, it changes state. Civilizations are like waves. Each one rises from the same ocean, gathers height and definition, then returns to the surface it came from. No wave possesses the water beneath it. No wave is separate from what follows. The ocean remains unchanged by which wave is remembered. This comparison does not diminish human effort. It places it gently. Meaning does not depend on permanence. A wave does not need to last forever to matter. Its motion is complete within its passing. Human history often treats permanence as success. The longer something lasts, the more valuable it is assumed to be. Yet this assumption creates unnecessary urgency. When permanence becomes the goal, rest feels like failure. Endings feel tragic. Cycles feel threatening. Seen differently, nothing essential is lost when a civilization ends. Its energy does not disappear. It recombines. Knowledge disperses. Sensibility diffuses. Influence seeps quietly into what follows. The shape dissolves, but the movement continues. The emotional tone remains deeply calming here. There is no rush to preserve everything. No panic about disappearance. Consciousness has expressed itself this way before, and it will again, in forms suited to conditions yet unseen. This perspective releases pressure. Civilizations do not need to be saved from impermanence. Impermanence is what allows them to exist at all. A shape that never changed would harden. Motion would stop. When urgency fades, attention softens. Effort feels lighter. The need to dominate history gives way to participation in it. Being part of a cycle does not reduce significance. It contextualizes it. Meaning does not come from lasting forever. It comes from fitting the moment it arises in. A civilization matters because of how it expresses awareness, not how long it resists dissolution. This understanding offers quiet relief. Endings are not erasures, they are returns. What mattered has already shaped what comes next. Nothing waits to be rescued. From within a civilization, impermanence feels unsettling. From outside, it feels natural. The narrative invites the listener to step briefly outside, to rest inside a wider view where urgency loses its grip. Human effort is not dismissed. It is honored without burden. People build, learn, love, and strive, because that is how awareness moves when given form. When that form dissolves, awareness moves on without regret. This is why civilizations repeat without repeating exactly. Each is a variation, not a copy. A different wave, shaped by different wind, carrying familiar motion. The forgotten civilization fits easily here. It was not meant to remain as structure. It was meant to pass through, leaving behind influence without insisting on continuity. Its completion required dissolution. Nothing essential was lost when it stepped away. Everything it mattered to express already entered the ocean. As this realization settles, the listener may feel the sense of urgency soften further. History no longer presses forward demanding solutions. It unfolds, it breathes, it rests. From impermanence, the narrative naturally turns toward rest itself. When shapes dissolve, motion slows. Attention shifts from building to settling, from striving to stillness. The next movement does not ask what comes next. It asks what happens when history itself relaxes, when the need to move gives way to the ability to be. Civilizations pass through, meaning remains. And in that knowing, something quiet opens, ready for the final descent into rest, where motion gives way to silence, and silence is no longer absence, but completion. At a certain depth, inquiry begins to slow on its own. Not because questions have been answered, but because they no longer need to be pursued. Curiosity loosens its grip. The mind, which once leaned forward searching for meaning, begins to rest back into presence. History does not close, it quiets. Questions do not disappear here. They soften. They lose urgency. What once demanded explanation now feels complete without one. The forgotten civilization no longer stands as a puzzle to be solved. It no longer asks for reconstruction, proof, or narrative clarity. It feels whole precisely because it does not require completion. The narration settles into this stillness gently. Understanding has shifted from accumulation to integration. The need to know gives way to the ability to feel. Insight moves out of language and into awareness, where it no longer needs to be defended or explained. Some truths are not designed to be solved. They are designed to be lived with until they dissolve into familiarity. When this happens, explanation becomes unnecessary. The story no longer needs to move forward, because it is already present everywhere it matters. This moment can feel unfamiliar. Modern thinking often equates stopping with failure. Seeking is treated as virtue. Closure is expected to arrive as an answer, a revelation, a final statement. But here, closure arrives as relaxation. The body recognizes what the mind no longer needs to grasp. The forgotten civilization belongs to this space now. It does not linger as mystery or absence. It feels integrated, its role complete. There is no tension left in its story. Nothing presses to be resolved. History itself begins to change character. It stops behaving like a problem to be examined, and starts behaving like a landscape to rest within. One does not analyze a horizon, one allows it to be seen. The emotional weight lightens. The desire to connect every thread loosens. Patterns no longer need to be named to be recognized. Meaning no longer needs to be extracted. It simply remains. This is the point where the search ends without ending. The mind is released from the obligation to continue digging. Curiosity transforms into acceptance. What matters has already been absorbed. For the listener, this shift is gentle. There is nothing to do, no belief to adopt, no conclusion to defend. Awareness settles into the rhythm that has been present all along, waiting beneath questions. Silence here is not emptiness. It is fullness without motion. A calm that does not require explanation. The cycle no longer needs to be traced because it is felt. The forgotten civilization rests comfortably in this quiet. Not forgotten, not remembered actively, but present in the way presence itself feels stable without effort. It no longer stands apart from the world. It has dissolved into it. This is where inquiry naturally gives way to rest. The story does not resist this. It allows it. Seeking has served its purpose. Understanding has arrived not as information, but as ease. The final answer, if it can be called that, does not arrive as a statement. It arrives as the absence of need. When the question dissolves, nothing is missing. Awareness remains. This is why the narrative slows here, why language grows simpler, why nothing new is introduced. The work has been done quietly, over time, without force. For those listening late at night, this is the moment where attention can drift without losing anything. There is nothing left to hold tightly, nothing left to resolve before sleep. The forgotten civilization no longer asks to be examined. It has become atmosphere. The cycle no longer asks to be interpreted. It has become rhythm. History stops asking questions because awareness no longer needs them. It has recognized itself in motion, in rest, in repetition, and in release. With this recognition, tension fades naturally. The mind loosens. The body follows. The story prepares to conclude not with an ending, but with settling. Nothing more needs to be said, and nothing has been left unsaid. The final movement does not bring answers. It allows everything to drift into place, where meaning rests without effort, and the quiet that remains is no longer searching, only present, steady, and complete. At the widest view, the story loosens its focus and gently releases human concern. Time keeps moving, not forward or backward, but onward in its own quiet way. History does not wait for witnesses. It does not require remembrance to continue. Motion persists, whether noticed or not. Civilizations rise, gather meaning, and dissolve back into the flow that carried them there. Nothing argues with this movement. There is no judgment, no reward, no loss tallied against endurance. What mattered has already done its work. Influence has already passed forward, reshaping what follows in ways no single age can fully perceive. The forgotten civilization fades here, not as mystery, not as tragedy, but as rhythm. It does not fall into darkness. It spreads into continuity. Its presence becomes indistinguishable from motion itself. What once felt distant now feels inevitable, almost familiar. From this distance, urgency disappears. The need to explain dissolves. Nothing asks to be rescued from impermanence. Every form is temporary, yet nothing essential is wasted. Awareness expresses itself, releases form, and continues. Humanity becomes one current among many, significant without being central. The earth turns, the sky changes, seasons repeat. Consciousness finds shape where conditions allow, then moves on when they no longer do. The narration grows softer because there is nothing left to resolve. The story does not conclude, it settles. Like water, finding level after disturbance, everything returns to calm without effort. Memory is no longer required to sustain meaning. The world carries forward what it needs. Influence recombines into new expressions. The past does not cling to presence, it trusts continuation. Here, the forgotten civilization feels complete, not because it has been understood, but because understanding is no longer necessary. Its role finished when balance was restored. Silence was never absence. It was transition. The listener is not asked to remember names, patterns, or lessons. Nothing needs to be carried consciously. What matters has already entered awareness in subtler forms, shaping perception without demand. Time continues without hesitation. Civilizations will form again, shaped by rhythms older than memory. Some will expand, some will rest, some will withdraw quietly, all will pass through. This is not pessimism, it is release. When nothing is required to last forever, presence becomes lighter. Participation feels honest. Letting go becomes natural. The story widens until it no longer belongs to history at all. It belongs to motion itself, to cycles unfolding without needing permission, to continuity that does not pause for reflection. The final quiet does not feel empty. It feels spacious. There is room here for rest. For those listening late, this is where attention can drift without fear of missing something important. Nothing more needs to happen. Nothing remains unresolved. Awareness does not need to hold the story anymore. The forgotten civilization no longer waits to be found. It has already moved where all things eventually move, into rhythm beyond memory. History does not need witnesses. It does not need preservation. It continues because continuation is what it does. The story carries on without us, just as it did before. And in that understanding, the need to follow it dissolves. What remains is stillness, not as ending, but as gentle continuation. A calm motion beneath everything, steady and patient, carrying time forward while allowing each form to appear, rest briefly, and then pass. The documentary does not close. It exhales. Nothing is missing. Nothing is unfinished. The rhythm continues, and listening fades naturally into rest.